Frozen, as if in mid-flight, the squadron still is there. 22 warplanes plunged to the bottom of the Pacific in 1944. Now, they're an underwater monument to those who are lost and to those who survived.
Probably the worst marine air disaster that has ever occurred.
And not a shot was fired by the Japanese.
Like the planes, the disaster sank out of sight, concealed from the enemy, classified from the public, then covered up to protect the reputation of a powerful officer.
As far as I'm concerned, he should have been shot.
But finally, the truth has emerged from these remote depths. And one of the last remaining stories of sacrifice, survival, and courage from World War II now can be told. Just a few survivors are left, but their memories are fresh, and the story of what happened in the Central Pacific still can be saved.
The war in the Pacific was big. We're talking geographically, a third of the surface of the planet was involved in the Great Pacific War. The American military faced in the Japanese Empire a truly brutal and sadistic foe.
By mid to late 1943, the U.S. military is launching a Central Pacific offensive. So it's a two-pronged assault against the innermost defenses of Japan.
More pilots and firepower are urgently needed for the fight. A group of eager young Marines are being trained on a state-of-the-art fighter called the F4U Corsair. The rookie pilots call themselves the Flying Buccaneers of Fighter Squadron VMF 422.
We had people from Mississippi, the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, Boston, from Chicago.
Lieutenant Robert Laynert, known as Curly, is a 22-year-old New Yorker who became a fighter pilot because of his hero, Eddie Rickenbacker.
Eddie Rickenbacker, remember, was a famous ace in World War I.
He shot down 26 enemy airplanes, along with winning the Medal of Honor in the process.
Sterling Shue Price from St. Louis enlisted to fulfill a boyhood dream.
I first decided I wanted to be a naval aviator when I was about 8 years old.
Joining Curly and Shue is Mark Sirkin, nicknamed Breeze after a B-movie character.
I grew up in New York, and when Lindbergh came back from his trip over the ocean, I was on my dad's shoulders during the parade. And at that point in time, I wanted to be a pilot.
Perhaps the squadron's best pilot was Royce Tex Watson from the plains of West Texas.
I was well checked out, and I flew the Corsair 2 or 3 times a day and became quite proficient in it.
Tex, Curly, Shue, Breeze, along with the other pilots, they were the Flying Buccaneers. After 9 months of intensive training, VMF 422 ships out for their first combat assignment. Their commander is a 28-year-old major from New Jersey named John McLaughlin.
This was a man who was a very proud fellow. He was a Naval Academy graduate, and this was his first command.
He was what I call a real leader.
There's no doubt that they adored McLaughlin. He was the epitome of a major from the Academy. There weren't that many Academy grad majors leading squadrons out there, so that really did make him unique.
In January 1944, McLaughlin and his pilots are dispatched to the battlefront, and they land on Tarawa.
They had just captured the island of Tarawa in the Central Pacific, Just a little while before this story unfolds.
The squadron will embark on a secret mission codenamed Operation Flintlock, the Navy and Marine assaults on the Marshall Islands.
It is a stepping stone to acquiring control of the Pacific Ocean.
If you were going to go and fight a campaign against Japan, you were going to have to go through the Marshall Islands. The Japanese had them, we had to take them.
One of the commanders of the mission is an imposing and temperamental brigadier general from South Carolina. Louis Griff Merritt is a lanky Southerner with a solid gold pedigree.
General Merritt was a product of a generation of Marine officers who had really shaped Marine aviation and really laid the foundation for what Marine aviation was to become during World War II.
General Merritt, while a very talented man, had a very irascible personality. He clearly believed in self-reliance, somewhat of a Darwinist. Survival of the fittest seemed to be his personal doctrine.
Now, Griff Merritt is in the thick of the fight for the Pacific. He's in charge of the 4th Marine Air Wing headquartered in Tarawa, which will provide the air defense of the Marshall Islands after they are captured by the ground forces. This promises to be his moment.
He was gearing up for Operation Flintlock. He wanted to make his mark in this operation.
But trying to seize his place in history, General Merritt also has to take precautions with his newly arrived planes. He fears the Japanese may send bombers to strike the airbase, jeopardizing his new squadron, the mission, and perhaps his own ambition.
He didn't want us around there. He wanted us to get out of there.
Merritt orders the squadron to move 800 miles to the south, away from the enemy, to the tiny island of Funafuti.
Back then, anything more than a 100-mile flight over water constituted a major act of navigation.
Normally, it's a policy for single-engine planes, even in a large group, when they have to fly a long distance over water, to follow a navigational lead. Sometimes they're called pathfinders. They'd have a crew with full communications gear and navigation gear.
Now, on the morning of January 24th, Major McLaughlin makes what seems like a routine request, an escort plane to guide his squadron.
He did ask for an escort. McLaughlin went to Burke.
Colonel Lawrence Burke, the operations officer for the 4th Marine Wing, kicks the request upstairs to his boss, General Merritt.
I was standing outside the tent. I heard this all. Burke came out and told McLaughlin, our CO, well, the general doesn't want to give you a escort because he needs the airplane for reconnaissance.
McLaughlin says, well, let's try him again.
Colonel Burke did. He went back. Well, the general got angry. They told him to get his butt out of there, and he didn't want to see him back in there anymore. He said, I'll send your butt back to the States.
Burke comes out, says no escort.
You got to go. So McLaughlin said, all right, we'll go.
No one realized that crystal clear morning, least of all Griff Merritt, just how ill-fated that decision would be. Without an escort plane, the flight plan remains the same. Take off from Tarawa, fly 460 miles to Nanumea, refuel, then proceed to Funafuti, a routine flight that pilots call a milk run. For navigation, radio beacons will guide them toward the tiny specks of land that are their destination. Initial weather reports show scattered light rain, but presumably perfect conditions for flying. At 9:30 a.m., January 25th, 1944, the Flying Buccaneers take off without a hitch.
Flight was proceeding just as planned, and they actually got almost all the way to their first fuel stop, Nanumea. But then they spot a black, towering wall of storm clouds ahead of them.
It was black, and it was as wide as you could see and as high as you could see.
The closer we got to it, it seemed to be on all sides of us.
Dark as far as the eye can see from the right to the left, from the bottom of the ocean all the way on up to about 35, 40,000 feet.
25-year-old Mark Bree Sirkin is one of the squadron's most seasoned pilots, but he has never dealt with anything like this.
It looked like somebody playing a fire hose in your cockpit. You couldn't see. We were beyond the point of no return. We couldn't go back, so we had to fly through it.
And even Tex Watson was seeing something he could not outfly.
There I was, a young country boy right off the plains of West Texas, flying a brand new 422 Corsair over the dark, deep Pacific Ocean. Lost.
The weather remains clear on the island of Tarawa, where General Griff Merritt is completely unaware of what's happening to his fighter squadron, the one he dispatched without an escort plane.
There was evidently no plan of operation or no contingency plan at all, that if somebody had trouble, what was to be done. None of that was discussed.
Surrounded on all sides by a Pacific storm they couldn't have anticipated, the Flying Buccaneers are minutes from their refueling destination of Nanumea.
What we didn't know is that we had a lot of bad information on weather, which was 48 hours old. We had bad information on some of the radio beacons over in the Pacific, from island to island and so forth.
Old reports, but new weather. This was a violent tropical typhoon.
They were basically in what they call the soup, or in the goo. Tropical storms out in the Pacific are a beast that you can't really compare anywhere else.
Squadron leader John McLaughlin quickly decides to guide the pilots over the storm. But as the Corsairs reach their altitude ceiling, the storm still is towering over them.
His next decision then was to descend and try to get underneath it. That's problematic for a couple of reasons. It can be risky because if the ceiling goes all the way to the surface, you have to be careful that you don't obviously fly into the water.
The waves were 30, 40, 50 feet high. We felt that it was a very dangerous situation at that moment.
They have no choice. The only way out of the storm is to fly into it.
What McLaughlin was looking at was a solid mountain of clouds in front of him. The choices were rather stark at this point. He was probably beyond the point of no return. He had to make his final destination.
Visibility drops to near zero. Instruments go haywire.
The static electricity, the compass in the airplane just spun like a top.
Flying blind, helter-skelter, all over the sky, the Corsairs are in imminent danger of colliding in midair.
And boy, it was hairy inside that storm because you're talking about 15, 16 airplanes all in one particular place, maneuvering in violent maneuvers, trying to avoid one another at the same time, stay alive.
We were making turns and turned one way and then another way. But with all of this commotion going on, guys got separated.
McLaughlin now is in a terrible dilemma. The electrical storm has made it difficult to find the Nanumea radio beam. So he maneuvers in tight turns to find it at the risk of tearing the formation apart.
McLaughlin was doing what he had to do to try to find out where they were, and it wasn't that he was deliberately putting the guys in the back of the formation in jeopardy. It's just a matter of the physics of that many planes trying to make a turn in terrible weather.
It's like in ice skating we used to call crack the whip.
The whip is coming around, and these guys just couldn't keep up, and they got flung off and separated.
Suddenly, 3 pilots veer away from the squadron. Captain John Rogers disappears and is never seen again. He is the first casualty of what is rapidly escalating into a full-blown disaster. With Rogers goes Lieutenant John Hansen, who decides to go it alone and avoid a mid-air collision.
My only salvation was that I was not about to go back down and try to join that formation.
Hansen flies away from the squadron to live or die on his own. The third lost pilot is Lieutenant Jake Wilson, who's running low on fuel and quickly descends. Through a break in the clouds, he sees a speck of land and makes a quick decision to crash his Corsair in the surf just off the island of Nui Tau.
He came down in shallow water just off the beach and saw that natives were coming out and was unsure of their intent.
He's got a bloody gash in his face. All of a sudden, he sees that he's surrounded by natives. And of course, the first question is, are they friendly? What he actually had done was go and land on a tropical paradise island full of very friendly natives.
The islanders help Wilson nurse his injuries and make him feel right at home. But, as he will find out, their hospitality comes at a price. High above Wilson, the remaining pilots are still lost, and now encountering a problem perhaps even more serious than the weather.
Sure enough, one of the engines started to have problems.
The engine of Lieutenant Chris Lawson.
An all-American boy, the type you might say, that's how I want my son to grow up and look like, just like him.
Curly Lehnert and Ken Gunderson descend toward Lawson, but can only watch as his engine quits, and he crash lands into the 40-foot ocean swells.
When he hit right into the side of one of those horrendous waves. And his plane went into that like an arrow. The plane never surfaced. After a while, I saw a head pop up.
Amazingly, Lawson still is alive, but without his raft. Only his life vest keeps him afloat.
To myself, I'm saying, this is bad.
Gunderson pinpoints Lawson's location for rescue by the military and returns to the formation. Lehnert, meanwhile, continues hovering over Lawson when a call comes over his radio telling him to rejoin the squadron.
I remember asking the question. I said, are we just going to leave him? And there was no answer.
He begins flying long circles around Lawson, who is struggling to survive.
It was a heart-rendering moment because I'm up here, he's down there, and he's kind enough to wave at me. But I envisioned that he was just saying, hey, thanks for staying with me.
As Chris Lawson fights for his life, 4 more pilots have vanished and are never seen again. As McLaughlin scrambles to save the rest of the squadron, his risky flight maneuvers suddenly pay off. He hits a break in the storm.
At this point, he picks up the beacon for their final destination, Funafui, and he makes the decision that rather than flounder around and perhaps lose people in the weather trying to find the refueling point, he will take the squadron and just fly directly to the final destination.
And we broke out to the middle of it and thought, well, we got the thing made now. The skipper even said, he said, I know where we are.
They knew they were close. The pilots knew they had to be fairly close. As it turned out, they were only around 8 miles away from their destination. Almost pathetically close. They came to being home.
But McLaughlin's plan is quickly foiled as the squadron slams into yet another violent storm.
And then bing, we hit the other side of it, and we started all over again.
And the commander loses the Funafui signal.
McLaughlin is desperately trying to find a way out. He is trying to save himself, his command, his men, and the airplanes that have been entrusted to him.
Captain Rex Jeans, McLaughlin's second in command, urges the major to return to the small island of Nui, which they had just passed over. McLaughlin agrees and lets Jeans take over.
Gene takes the lead and tries to direct them back to Nui Island so that they can get a fix on their position.
As McLaughlin steps down, he seems like a ghost of the former self-confident commander.
At this point, something odd happens. McLaughlin stops interacting on the radio with the other members of the squadron. He seems unable to act, maybe even in a trance, and seems to go off on his own.
There is one other pilot who is flying alone. Lieutenant John Hansen had been separated from the formation in the first moments of the storm, but has managed to pick up a radio beam and is now flying in the clear.
I just made the immediate decision to try to go to Funafuti.
Locked on to the Funafuti beam, Hansen heads due south over the empty ocean.
I looked out the side, and here was an island with a runway.
Of the 23 pilots, Hansen is the luckiest and the first to land safely at the squadron's destination with 80 gallons of gas left in his tank.
The guys came out to find out why I was there, and I told them that we had a whole squadron that was headed that way, and they knew nothing about it.
Of all the human mistakes that compounded a natural disaster, this was one of the most serious. General Merritt's team on Tarawa was never in communication with the islands along the squadron route between Tarawa and Funafuti.
When 422 left, nobody forwarded the information that, okay, this flight of Corsairs has left our island, heading your way. That information was never sent to Nanumea.
They were doing maintenance on the radios. They didn't think anybody'd be up flying in this kind of weather. They turned it on, fiddled with it and adjusted things and whatnot, and then turned it off.
And no one knew an entire Marine Air Squadron was lost until John Hansen landed on Funafuti. Finally, some 4 hours into the disaster, at least someone on the ground knows what has happened in the air. But it may be too late to save the remaining pilots because now they're all running dangerously low on fuel. Especially Curly Lehnert, who has been rapidly burning fuel orbiting above Chris Lawson. Still adrift at sea and nothing but a life vest.
Each time I went down, I could see him waving. I said, "Good boy. No, sharks haven't gotten you."
Now Lehnert's own tanks are running dry. He faces a critical decision: bail out in his parachute or attempt a water landing like Lawson.
He was a good swimmer, good athlete. If he didn't get his raft out, what makes you think you're gonna get it out? So I decided to bail out.
Lehnert positions his Corsair as close to Lawson as he dares and jumps.
Pulled the ripcord, out came the parachute, no problem.
After hitting the water, Lehnert inflates the raft and crawls in with the survival gear intact. The plan has worked, except for one thing.
I make an attempt to see where Lawson is.
Lawson!
Well, I soon found out that with the waves, that Lawson could have been 10 yards away from me, and I never would have seen him.
The waves are like mountains, and Lehnert, trapped between them, can't see over or around them.
Never saw Lawson at all, and as far as I know, he perished at sea.
Now, Curly Lehnert is stuck in a tiny raft in the boundless ocean, alone. High above, and miles to the south, 14 pilots are desperately trying to stay together to stay alive. But alarmingly, one of them is drifting away and out of radio contact. Squadron leader John McLaughlin. Lieutenant John Lincoln from Massachusetts, called Abe by his buddies, spots McLaughlin's plane and radios him to rejoin the formation.
Well, just, hey, here I am, boss.
No response. Risking a mid-air collision, Lincoln decides to fly within inches of McLaughlin's plane to signal him by hand.
I try to get Major McLaughlin to say something, look at me. I bang, in fact, once so much as bang the wing with mine. And nothing.
Lincoln flies for several minutes on McLaughlin's wing before the realization dawns.
And I gave you my opinion. He was an academy guy, and orders are orders, and I just lost my whole command, first command. He could look at the planes, he knew he lost guys. And he knew he was going to lose a whole set of brand new airplanes, 22 of them. But nothing, he wouldn't even look.
Left with the haunting image of his commander frozen in the cockpit, Lincoln can do nothing more. He peels away and rejoins the formation. McLaughlin disappears over the horizon, never to be seen again. 9 pilots, and now their commander, are missing. And the drama in the air is only just beginning. The 13 remaining pilots are now almost out of fuel. So Captain Rex Jeans issues a desperate order, the only one that might keep the squadron together.
He said, the next plane that runs out of gas, we're all going to circle them and set one down after the other and stay together. Or he says, we'll never get picked up if we scatter planes all over the Pacific Ocean.
The squadron will now survive or perish as one.
Just think of it, being out over the dark blue Pacific Ocean in a burning aircraft and driving a rainstorm in a hurricane.
Put all the flaps down I could put down and got it as slow as I could get it. And I dragged the tail in the water for a little way, but the minute that big heavy engine caught the water, why, bam, and I mean, it's like running into a brick wall.
Once that plane hits the water, there's less than a minute to get everything out that you're going to require to survive on the open ocean. Your Mae West, your life vest, any sort of survival gear. It's less than a minute. You have to have it all with you, or it's going to be gone forever.
I was out of that airplane and in my boat by the time the last of the tail disappeared, which took a total of about 40 seconds.
Nearby, Tex Watson is in over his head.
I was drowning. I'd taken on a lot of water. And I tell the good Lord I need some more help.
With nothing left but his faith and will, Tex Watson summons the last ounce of strength to climb aboard the tiny raft. There is one Marine still in the air, Bree Serkin. The kid from Long Island surprises everyone by coming in with guns blazing.
They thought I'd gone bonkers because I was firing my guns like a mad fool, but I was getting rid of my load on that thing, the ammunition and all the heavy stuff I could think of, and chucking it out of the cockpit and everything else.
And the boys in the raft said, look at there. Old Bree's done gone berserk and gonna shoot old Watson's ass down.
Serkin bails out, inflates his raft, and heads toward the faint sound of the whistles his buddies are blowing.
I started kicking my feet and pushing the raft in front of me, but then I kicked something in the water. And I looked behind me, and there's a fin going by. There were 3 sharks. I got back in that raft so fast you wouldn't believe what I did in that raft. I got into that thing.
It would not be the last shark that Serkin or his buddies encountered.
There you go. You okay? Yeah.
Miles from nowhere is a small flotilla of 13 men in rafts the size of a baby's bassinet.
They're in a world of hurt, and they don't know if they're going to be rescued or if they're going to drift into oblivion. No matter where you looked, you just saw nothing but an oceanscape and sky. I think you would feel very, very insignificant and very, very helpless.
Five hours after his squadron flew into a typhoon, General Merritt is none the wiser. Not only did his staff fail to predict the storm, they neglected to inform all the nearby islands that his planes were en route. But Curly Laynard is in a far more dire situation. He's all by himself. Nobody knows if he's adrift or somehow flew to safety. His tiny raft, just an insignificant speck on a vast ocean. Still, he has a survival plan inspired by his boyhood hero.
4 months earlier, I had read an article in Life magazine of Eddie Rickenbacker going down at sea in about the same area we were.
When they found him alive, it was a really encouraging story for the whole country.
To receive honors paid to him by his hometown comes one of the great figures of aviation, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker.
My theory was, if Eddie Rickenbacker could last 24 days, Curly Laynard can last for 24 days.
Fighting the current, strategizing, improvising. If no one else will save him, Curly Laynard will save himself.
I'm good for 24 days. After that, I'll face it.
Miles away from Laynard, the other Marines are still afloat, hunkering down for a long night on the open sea.
No idea where you are? Remember, you stop and think what would happen to your mind.
At night, you freeze to death out there because even though you're on the equator, it's cold. So we used to urinate in the rafts to keep us warm.
To stay together, they connect the rafts, forming a circle. And to pass the endless dark hours, all the pilots pray.
I was saying my rosary, being a good Catholic boy. My mother would like to believe. I always figured if anybody could help me, it'd be the Mother of God, because I don't think God would have too much to do with me.
Rescued by islanders after crash landing his Corsair, Lieutenant Jake Wilson is now enjoying a hero's welcome.
Of all the experiences of the survivors of this disaster, the one of Wilson landing on the native island is the one which sounds like it's out of a Hollywood script.
The natives throw him a lavish South Pacific-style banquet. But as the night wears on, the chief has a surprise for Wilson.
Wilson was faced by an unusual dilemma, and that the tribal chief on the island had taken a great liking to him and decided that he needed to go and choose one of the young women of the tribe and take her as his wife.
With a sweetheart back home in Mississippi, Wilson isn't ready to take this particular plunge. He comes up with a plan to buy some time.
Wilson feigned being slightly ill and asked that the chief graciously allow him a little time to delay this decision. Quite frankly, native hospitality won out over the necessities of tribal ritual.
At least for now. Day 2 at sea. Visibility unlimited. The ocean is like glass. The perfect day to be rescued.
I felt like maybe I was actually over land in a lake because it was so calm.
All by himself, Curly Laynard is trying to paddle to safety across the endless Pacific. But even if a rescue plane should appear, he is practically invisible.
It's like a needle in a haystack, really, searching for an object that's floating around in the Pacific.
Yet, there is still not one patrol plane on the horizon. It is as if VMF 422 has been forgotten. Miles away, the 13 men on the chain of rafts still manage to keep a semblance of discipline. They ration food supplies and water. They ready the flares and packets of dye that will alert a rescue team to their position.
It's a tribute to the American spirit not to get down about things, and we could have been very much down after that debacle in the water.
Hours pass. No ship or plane appears. All they can do is prepare, pray, and wait. The morning also brings a new menace. Sharks. 3 of them. First they circled, now they're inching closer, too close, until the most aggressive one actually starts slamming into the rafts.
You got a check out of his fin. He took kind of a liking to my bottom of my boat.
That's an eerie feeling when you have about a 1/16 of an inch of rubber between you and the shark.
Back on dry land, Lieutenant Jake Wilson is running out of time. The chief continues to press him to marry one of his island girls. But Wilson has found an unlikely ally.
Hoping to avoid for the longest possible time the spear-tip wedding he was facing. Wilson was fortunate that with him on the island was in fact a radio operator that called the Allies, which then dispatched a destroyer to come pick him up.
Just in time, as Wilson couldn't delay his wedding much longer.
He was rescued from both his wartime castaway experience as well as the enforced wedding, and allowed him to get back to civilization and back to his service.
But for the 13 pilots, there is still no rescue in sight. Now it's getting dark, and another mass of black clouds is brewing on the horizon.
The weather was starting to get nasty again. We decided maybe we better hold hands, and we did that all night long. We held each other's hands like this. We took the shock in our own arms. And that second night was a dinger. And the waves seemed like 50 feet high, and you'd be going up 1 minute and down the next minute. And you thought, oh my God, that next wave's gonna crash over the top of us, but the little boats, they rode them right on up to the top of the next wave, and that's what we did all night long.
On Tarawa Island, headquarters of General Merritt, reports are now surfacing about the missing squadron. But neither Merritt nor anyone else has the slightest clue where they are or even if they're alive. Several hundred miles away, the 13 pilots have survived yet another harrowing night. The human chain has held. But holding hands all night to keep from drifting apart has pushed them into exhaustion. Another night, another storm, and the chain of rafts may break.
Because Hansen did make it to the reception area at Funafuti, the authorities were aware that there were men out on the water. And by this time, they had ships, they had aircraft, even submarines out scouring that area between Funafuti and Tarawa, looking for men on the water.
Still, the morning passes with an empty sky.
That's a big ocean. Everything is 500-600 miles apart. It's a huge ocean.
Only the sharks seem interested in finding the 13 pilots.
Those bums seem to be around all the time we're there.
They'd been getting more and more friendly as time went on. They were getting closer, rubbing their fin along the bottom of the boat.
The sharks are so familiar that the pilots have named them: Oscar, Herbert, and the boldest one, Leroy.
Somebody decided Charlie should shoot the shark.
Charlie, Captain Charles Hughes, still has his pistol, which remarkably still works after being soaked in salt water, and he draws a bead on Leroy.
Charlie Hughes got his pistol out, and he finally shot the one shark. And the other ones took out after the wounded one.
Now, more interested in feeding on their friend Leroy, the remaining sharks follow his bloody trail and disappear, never to be seen again. It's also day 3 for Curly Lehnert, all alone on the open ocean. But he is bracing for at least 21 more days at sea, just like his hero, Eddie Rickenbacker.
I'm doing my usual light paddling, and I looked out, and on the horizon, oh, way out there, was something that either looked like a plane or looked like a bird. I realized that it was a plane.
This may be his best and only chance of being spotted. If the pilot makes one sudden turn, Laynard may never be rescued.
He comes straight on. And if I may use the expression, he flew right up my asshole.
Laynard preps his flare pistol. He has a split second to fire a single shot to get the pilot's attention. One chance to get it right.
He goes right up here. I fire the pistol. And oh, he goes right by me. And then eventually, he rocks the big wings of that seaplane. And now I've been found.
The plane is a Navy PBY, a two-engine flying boat often used for rescuing downed pilots. Lieutenant Herb Shively lands near Laynard's raft and plucks him out of the sea.
And they took me into Funafuti. Funafuti was the very same place that Eddie Rickenbacker and the crew members had been brought in after they were rescued.
Now, Curly Laynard hits the island, bracing for a hero's welcome.
I'm standing, waiting for the life photographers to be there. No life photographers, a couple of plane mechanics, and I'm in my underwear.
Day 3 passes on the empty horizon. 13 men brace themselves for yet another harrowing night at sea. John Lincoln is spending the endless hours saying his rosary.
All of a sudden I looked up and I saw a plane.
About that time, Lincoln says, aircraft.
I think I see it.
The commander of the Navy PBY is Ensign George Davidson. He was searching for Japanese submarines when his co-pilot spotted something unexpected.
He put the glasses on us and he said, there's somebody down there. And then he said, oh my God, there's a whole bunch of them down there.
I sent my position and I asked for instructions, and they said, that's up to you.
He was afraid that if he didn't land and try to pick us up then, they might not be able to find us the next day.
It's getting dark and windy. Waves are kicking up. Davidson, who has never made a landing under such harrowing circumstances, faces a crucial decision. Does he risk his own life and the crew's to save 13 downed pilots?
A PBY, it was designed to land in more protected bodies of water like bays and inlets. Landing into 30-foot swells, the pilot had to know that the aircraft was going to take a beating.
I thought it was best to go in and save them. If they'd not have been out there, I'd expect the same.
He had to know that his chances of ever getting the aircraft off the water again were slim and none.
He took his life, himself and his crew, in his hands to even set that thing down.
When he landed that thing in the worst ocean I've ever seen anybody who could do that is a marvelous pilot.
It was probably one of the happiest times in my life when that PBY came down and landed. So everybody was praying that, or thanking the Lord for answering their prayers.
But the landing comes at a steep price.
When I did drop in, a wave came right over the plane and my right engine disappeared. It just tore it right off the plane.
Even worse, there are now cracks in the plane's hull. The PBY is taking on water. Still, Davidson proceeds with the rescue, though he may soon need one himself.
We were getting aboard, and then one of the lines broke, and 4 or 5 of the guys drifted away.
And sailed off into the night.
And at the worst possible time, in mid-rescue, John Lincoln and 4 other pilots are on the wrong side of it.
Saying, oh, Jesus, they got everybody else but us. So you stop and think, Jesus, they got to leave us out here?
George took off with that PBY and circled in the darkness, looking for guys floating around until the ability to rest.
For nearly 2 hours, Davidson and his crew plow through the high waves and wind. desperately looking for 5 men in 5 tiny rafts.
And he found them, which is it's a miracle. He pulled them all in, and we were all laying on the floor of that PBY.
With the extra weight and only 1 engine, the plane can't take off, nor can it stay afloat for long. Davidson radios for help.
I think it was about midnight. The destroyer pulled up. The Hobby, USS Hobby.
After a 6-hour rescue drama on top of the 3-day ordeal at sea, the 13 remaining pilots finally are safe, although exhausted, traumatized, and badly in need of their first meal in 3 days.
They asked me how much I normally weighed. I said around 140 pounds. I said, well, you're down to 119.
The final toll, 22 Corsairs at the bottom of the ocean, 6 men dead, the worst losses ever sustained by a Marine Air Squadron outside of combat. Losses so great that someone, somewhere in the chain of command, must be held accountable.
A loss of a squadron is the loss of a major chess piece if you're trying to run a campaign like Operation Flintlock. It's not something you want the enemy to know, that an entire squadron of your best fighters have just been thrown away. And yet, someone has to be assessed responsible.
The disaster at sea is finally over, but the blame game and the cover-up are just beginning. Aboard the USS Curtis, anchored off Tarawa, a secret hearing begins. The investigation focuses on the possible causes and misconduct by the pilots, including Commander Major John McLaughlin. His superior, who was in charge of the 4th Marine Air Wing, Brigadier General Louis G. Merritt, also is scrutinized.
During the inquiry, General Merritt was questioned by a number of the board members about with VMF 422. Basically, he unrepentantly says, yes, they were under my command, and no, I felt no responsibility to do anything for them. So not only does he not take ownership, but in fact, he takes no responsibility or even culpability into account. It's almost in the record as if he's obtusely insulted that he's even being asked this question.
The allegations against Merritt are grave, that he should have supplied an escort plane for the squadron, and that it would have, in all probability, prevented the disaster. And in fact, his policy was not to provide escorts on flights of this nature. In addition, his team improperly reported the flight after takeoff from Tarawa to the islands along the squadron's route. In wartime, military justice is swift. Just weeks after the disaster, the Board of Inquiry delivers its verdict. They find fault with Major John McLaughlin for his decision to enter the storm and his erratic maneuvers, leading to the fatal breakup of the squadron.
It was easy for everyone to blame McLaughlin because he was dead and he had no chance to rebut or defend himself.
As for General Louis Merritt, he receives just a recommendation that a letter of reprimand be entered into the record.
A letter of reprimand is, to a career officer, a little bit more than a slap on the wrist. That goes into your record. It points the finger at Merritt. Merritt obviously should have provided an escort. They saw it, he neglected to do his duty, and that's a strong statement.
A reprimand, no court-martial, as the pilots of the lost squadron were expecting.
If anybody should have been cited for this, it should have been General Merritt. It was his responsibility.
The pilots are furious that the brunt of the blame goes to Major McLaughlin, not General Merritt.
As far as I'm concerned, he should have been shot.
But military protocol requires a final examination, and the report is reviewed by several high-ranking officers.
Perhaps the most damning judgment came eventually from Admiral Pownall, who basically wanted to court-martial General Merritt, relieve him of his command, and wanted to go ahead and make an example of him about what to not be as a Marine Corps aviation officer.
He also recommends that Major John S. McLaughlin should be freed from blame. There is one final review from the Navy top brass. They exonerate Major McLaughlin and his pilots of all blame. But General Merritt is not court-martialed. Only the letter of reprimand stands. Limited details of the disaster are released to the public. The case is quickly closed, classified, and filed away. There still is a war to fight. VMF 422 reforms just in time for Operation Flintlock. Unlike the prolonged, bloody battles for other Pacific islands, the Marshalls fall quickly. The U.S. begins seizing control of the war in the Pacific, inching ever closer to striking distance of mainland Japan.
President's report to a waiting world.
In August 1945, the war in the Pacific finally comes to an end.
In New York City, as throughout a rejoicing nation and world, vast throngs of grateful, happy people celebrate the end of fighting, the dawn of peace. 2 million New Yorkers jam Times Square. It's official. It's all over. It's total victory.
But lost in the celebration is the story of VMF 422, the Lost Squadron, whose story is all but forgotten. General Merritt's career doesn't miss a beat despite his reprimand. Just a few months after the tragedy, he was transferred back to the States to assume another command. He was eventually promoted to Major General and awarded a Bronze Star for, quote, meritorious conduct as a commander. After the war, Merritt capped his career by retiring to a private law practice in South Carolina. Even so, he seemed obsessed with erasing the blot on his name that, as he wrote, threatens to haunt me for eternity.
Merritt spent virtually the rest of his life trying to both live down and eliminate this reprimand from his military record.
He attempts through erroneous comments and actually falsehoods to absolve himself of all responsibility in the matter.
What concerned Merritt the most was his role in the disaster and that he refused to provide an escort plane for the squadron.
Merritt has the gall to say, and if this comes out as written, it will affect my law practice in South Carolina. Outrageous.
In the end, Merritt's lobbying campaign succeeds. His role in the disaster essentially remains a secret.
When Robert Sherrod went to write the history of Marine Corps aviation in World War II, he sort of lays the blame at McLaughlin's feet by saying that he didn't demand an escort, as was his right to do. And I think that was a little bit unfair, and it took the spotlight away from Brigadier General Merritt.
It could well be said that Merritt succeeded in literally rewriting history.
This is from the book itself. Major McLaughlin asked whether an escort plane would be provided for the 700-mile flight to Funafuti, but did not request one, as he was privileged to do. According to the official record, that is an outright lie.
Merritt took the secret to his grave. In 1974, the old general died and was given full military honors. Today, a Marine airfield in South Carolina bears his name. There is no name to the ghostly airfield at the bottom of the Pacific, where the force of nature and human negligence conspired to sink 22 brand new fighter planes. It has taken decades to unlock the secrets held by these sunken Corsairs, but the men who long ago flew them have never stopped remembering what happened here.
After the war, we rendezvoused at reunions, and there was always a certain kinship to the pilots They created a bond that exists to this day.
Sometime in the not-too-distant future, all the remaining pilots will fly once again with their beloved commander, Major John McLaughlin, into the murky unknown. But now, the Flying Buccaneers of VMF 422 have completed their final mission. The story that has taken so long to tell finally has surfaced from the depths of the Pacific. The mystery revealed about what really happened here and who is responsible.